Welcome to the walkthrough of frequently made mistakes that I observed while reviewing Assignment 2B for my CS 5254 course in summer of 2023. First, here's something left over from the previous assignment, Assignment 2A, in the shutdown now method. Make sure that the filter expression is done correctly. This expression is incorrect and therefore won't pass the tests. Also, make sure that you integrate all my recommended fixes for Assignment 2A into your final submission for Assignment 2B so we can grade everything and give you a complete grade for your whole Assignment 2 work. Let's now turn our attention to some issues that occur within the simple semaphore.java file. First, this method, acquire uninterruptibly, needs to be using a loop. This code is using recursion, which can easily lead to Stack Overflow if it keeps having problems with when interrupts occur. So make sure that you are using something much more scalable like a loop rather than trying to use recursion in this case. Got some other problems here with acquire uninterruptibly. This code does not conform to the specification comment above. You need to make sure that you call the acquire implementation in a loop. So call your acquire implementation in a loop here to avoid code duplication, and that's not what's being done here. It's duplicating the code, and of course will also fail the tests. Yet another problem with acquire uninterruptibly. There's no need to call thread interrupted here, and there's no reason to use this loop with this loop condition because it'll defeat the whole purpose of being able to be acquired in an uninterruptible way. So make sure that you don't do this. This code is incorrect. Yet another problem with acquire uninterruptibly. This call is insufficient. It's just doing this interrupted at the end of the catch statement. Instead, what you need to do is you need to set a flag that would be defined up here somewhere. And then at the end of this method, you need to check that flag and then call thread.currentThread is interrupted. So now let's turn our attention to some problems with the release method for a simple semaphore. First, don't acquire the lock within the try block, but instead move it to before the try block. The reason for this is if this method call was to throw an exception, the lock would be in some inconsistent state, and we don't want to try to unlock it if it's in some inconsistent state. So make sure you move that before the try block. I think I've mentioned this quite a number of times before. Also, in this case, only call signal when m permits is greater than 0, otherwise you'll have some problems. And then also, please move this increment of m permits by 1 into the try portion here before signal is called. And the reason for this is you need to make sure that the increment of m permits is protected by the lock. And by the time we get down here, we've already released the lock. So that's going to be a big problem. And you'll have very subtle and pernicious race conditions. Let's now turn our attention to some issues that arise in the implementation of the Palantiri manager subclass. This code here, as you can see, is duplicating the initialization of simple semaphore and lock. I'm not sure why, but that's unnecessary. So please don't do that. It doesn't really matter which place you do this initialization, but don't do it in two places. I would recommend actually doing it up here. That's where it belongs. And there's no need to call this method to call size a Palantiri map. I'm not sure what the point of that was. It's not being used for anything useful. Now let's turn our attention to some issues with acquire. This try catch block is unnecessary and redundant, so please remove it. There's no point in catching the interrupted exception just to turn around and rethrow it. Instead, if the interrupted exception occurs, just let it be thrown outside the scope as normal. So you don't need to try catch that. Compiler probably should warn you about that, but to the extent that the compiler's IDE doesn't warn you, just make sure you don't do those kind of things. Down here, let's take a look at acquire. Make sure to acquire the lock before the try block. Same reason as for acquiring the lock for ReentrantLock that we talked about a couple of methods ago. You want to make sure you don't have some inconsistent intermediate state that is then trying to be released later. Down here, don't call unlock anywhere except in the finally block below. I haven't even tried to keep track of the number of times I've told people to do this. Make sure you always call unlock in a finally portion. You will thank me for this at some point. And down here, don't unlock this lock conditionally. You need to always unlock it. So let's turn our attention now to some problems with release. As you can see, there's no need to use atomic Boolean. I'm not sure why it's being used, but don't do it. You don't need it. You also don't need to check to see if the current thread has been interrupted. Down here, the release has some more problems. Please move this call to before the try block for the same reasons we've talked about for the other places where it was an issue. And remember that replace can return null. So you need to check for that case and handle it correctly. Once again, always call unlock in the finally block. Don't be calling it here. It causes all kinds of trouble in subtle ways, and don't unlock this lock conditionally. Always unlock it. So let's now take a look at the final problem with the release method. Once again, way too many calls to unlock occurring outside of the finally block. This is doing it in many places. Please do not do that. And you also want to move the call to semaphore release later, most probably in the finally portion, but that way you don't have to worry about it not getting released. But make sure you only release it if replace returns the right value. So this code probably needs to be improved in that way as well. So that's the end of the frequently made mistakes walkthrough for assignment 2B. Please make sure that you address these in your final submission, which is going to be due relatively soon. Please take a look at the website for more information on when it's due.